So here's a thought. What if a big city housing agency decided that it wanted to do a kind of a social experiment? Give people a little bit more money for their housing voucher than perhaps would normally be given, put them into a better environment, and see what happens. See if maybe they begin to deal with some of the systemic problems that plague all of our public housing systems in America. What do you think? We'll talk about that on Chicago Newsroom.
From Chicago's CAN TV, a look at the week's events is reported in the newspapers, in the blogs and online, and on radio and TV. This is Chicago Newsroom.
Well, hi. Welcome to another edition of Chicago Newsroom here on CAN TV. I'm Ken Davis, and thanks for joining us. Today, the CHA and what came to be called the super-voucher program, or what the reader refers to as the golden ticket. It's a very deeply disturbing and very complicated issue, and if you're going to go along with us on the ride today, you might need to bring a pad and paper with you, because a pencil, because we're going to give you a lot of numbers and it gets hard to figure it out. We are joined today by Maya Dukmasova, who is one of the co-authors of this story in The Reader, and also by Robin Amer, who's news editor of The Reader. Glad to have you both with us today. As I said, a story that is better in print than on television. Let's be frank about it, right? But here's what we get. We have something called the exception payment standards, or super vouchers. Who got this ball rolling and why? And along the way, we'll figure out how you got involved in the story, Maya, and how you began to dig all of this out. We've seen some stories about folks living in high rises with beautiful views of the lake and getting it paid for by us, the taxpayers. And it seems pretty outrageous. And it has had some pretty strong kickback in the media. But I know that from the moment that I started seeing those stories, I started thinking, there's got to be another story behind this. And apparently you were working on that all along. So what is this thing? So,
my colleague Mir Benait and I heard about this program just like everybody else around the summer of 2014, and thought, what is this thing? And it took a while to really understand. But the super voucher program, as it was dubbed in the media, inside the Chicago Housing Authority, it's known as exception payment standards. Started in 2010 under Louis Jordan's administration at the CHA. And the idea was that by 2010, the CHA had gotten rid of the vast majority of its public housing, and folks overwhelmingly used vouchers as their housing subsidy in the city of Chicago.
They got rid of their units, the physical units.
Right. And so Section 8 vouchers, or housing choice vouchers, became the primary vehicle for subsidized housing in the city. And by 2010, it was also clear that these vouchers were not providing enough money for folks to really have access to all parts of the city. Essentially, the north side of Chicago, closer to downtown, neighborhoods like Lakeview, near North, Lincoln Park, of course, were basically off limits to families with vouchers, because the voucher amounts did not provide enough money to cover the rent. A landlord could go to rent the apartment on the market and get more money for it than the voucher would bring. And so this program was born out of this reality. Louis Jordan and his colleagues at the CHA at the time thought that it would be a good idea to give some flexibility to voucher families, and essentially if a family was going to move to a high opportunity area where there were lots of jobs and good schools and lower crime, such as near North, such as Lincoln Park, that they would get more money for their voucher, that the voucher would be flexible to allow a family to move into a more expensive neighborhood.
You bring up something, and there's going to be a lot of these little detours along the way here, I can just tell, but you bring up something I think is so critical about the way the voucher program is structured. It works on like a median, right? So it's like the median takes in the rents that are the highest rents in the city and the rents for the biggest dumps in the city. And you come up with this kind of median number. So not only does it not give you a chance to get into better housing, but it also creates this whole separate market, which is again a different discussion, for landlords who want to take advantage because they've got, let's face it, substandard places in substandard neighborhoods, and they can get much better rents if they get a voucher person in there, right?
Right.
Yeah, this was actually one of the things that really surprised me the most about this story, when Merba and Maya brought it to me, was that because the city defines what they call fair market rent by averaging rents across the city, whether it's the Gold Coast or Englewood, you get vouchers that are worth too little to get you good housing in a nice North Side neighborhood, but they are excessive for housing in poorer neighborhoods. So you have this difficult, almost catch-22 situation if you're a voucher holder, where you don't quite have enough money to get into a nice place in a nice neighborhood, but you're being taken advantage of potentially by landlords who own substandard housing in poorer neighborhoods, who are getting more from voucher holders than they would from the average tenant.
They could ever hope
right.
to get. Yeah.
And I think the important thing to reiterate of what Maya said is that you ended up in this situation where you have, as of 2013, which was the last full year of this program, more than 36,000 people in the city who have Section 8 vouchers, right? Those are all of the people who have any kind of voucher from CHA. And the vast majority of those voucher holders are living in highly segregated, impoverished South Side and West Side neighborhoods. So you have a voucher system that is reinforcing the patterns of segregation that have existed in Chicago for decades. And this super voucher program that we looked into in great detail was this tiny, tiny effort to get some small percentage of these voucher holders out of poor segregated neighborhoods and into nicer integrated neighborhoods in the city. That was the program's reason for being. And I think that, as we worked on the story, that's what we found so tragic about the program's demise, was that its intention was pro-integration, which is something I think if you kind of look at that goal on its face, most people would say, oh yeah, integrated housing, that's a worthy goal and a worthy aspiration. Some might,
right. Because if you know the history of Chicago and the history of the Chicago Housing Authority, to put integration and the Chicago Housing Authority in the same sentence, you could get thrown in prison for that. So you actually were able to meet some of the people who had these, whatever you want to call them, golden tickets, and not for long, of course, because the program only lasted a couple of years. But did you get any sense at all that in its brief life, this program showed any hope or promise?
Absolutely. So one of the people that we profile in the story, her name is Lorena, and she moved to Chicago with her teenage son. And they were from South Bend, Indiana, and basically there was a much smaller voucher program. They lived in a pretty standard neighborhood there, but then they moved to Chicago, and Lorena realized that her choices with the voucher were very limited, and that she would possibly have to live in a neighborhood where her son would be potentially, in danger of being harassed by police or being, harassed by gang members, or just experience a lot of difficulties with the transition to the big city. Now, she had gotten a job close to Chicago, and the move was inevitable, and this program gave her an opportunity to, she had great credit, she checked all the boxes that you needed to check to even qualify for one of these things, and the program gave her an opportunity to live in a safe neighborhood. Her son was able to complete high school early, and he started college at Malcolm X and taking some classes at Harold Washington as well. Her ability to get to work was much better living closer to her job. So definitely there was it was a great benefit for this family. And one aspect, and this didn't make it into the story, but a lot of the people who benefited from these vouchers were actually disabled people. So there were quite a few veterans, for example, that were able to get into good housing as a result of the program. There were people in wheelchairs. I mean, I spoke with one gentleman who was living in a storage unit in a wheelchair. He was a veteran. Through this program, he was able to get handicap accessible housing in a downtown building. There were a few other people in his situation living in that same building, and it changed his life. He was able to, his health recovered. He started participating in the Paralympics after that. He got a job at the VA. So this was people that I spoke to who benefited from the program really were unequivocal about how this basically changed turned their whole life around.
Yeah, I would say that my perception from the people that we talked to is that it gave them a degree of stability that they had not had prior to that, and that they would not have had either living in poor neighborhoods subject to the housing market, or living in poor neighborhoods with a Section 8 voucher.
There are so many, at this point, so many other sort of avenues that we could travel to talk about this, because you have written, the reader certainly has reported in the past, on the difficulties that the voucher program has had in other areas, and the fact that the CHA was sitting on millions and millions and millions of dollars for years that it could have been giving out in vouchers. But I do think it is important just to again bookmark the fact that the amount of the total voucher money pool that was used for this program was teensy-weensy, right?
Yeah, less than $5 million.
Less than $5 million in a $1 billion budget.
It was less than 0.5% of the agency's overall budget.
But it is such big, fat bait. It is such a piñata for investigative news reports and for Congress people who want to make a name for themselves and that kind of thing. And that's what this program ended up being, this big water balloon.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you just look at, I think that the difficulty with this story and one of the reasons it became so polarizing, right, because that was one of the things that drew us to this story, was that it was so polarizing in the press when the story broke in 2014. One way to look at it, which is the way that we ultimately looked at it, is that this amount of money was a very small amount of money. But when you see, these golden ticket holders were given as much as $3,100 a month for a 2-bedroom apartment, and that some of them ended up in places like Aqua Tower, I mean, that was why people had the kind of explosive reaction to it that they did.
Yeah.
Because
it's so visceral, it's so emotional.
$3,100 a month for
I've got a CHA person living in Aqua Tower. And
but
one person.
But that was the thing that we found. It was one person.
Yeah.
So not only did we find that this was a tiny fraction of the agency's overall budget, that there were only a tiny number of people who ever qualified for these so-called super vouchers. I think 22 people in the last year of the program, if I'm remembering correctly,
got the full 300%.
And we should probably explain what that means.
We should.
Yeah. So I'll come back to that. But if you consider the amount of money that the CHA spends on substandard housing and segregated neighborhoods, or the amount of money that it takes them to build new units of public housing or renovate new units of public housing, this was arguably much more cost effective than any of the things that they had tried in the past. So to go back and explain like how you get these and how much money you get, like we said, there's a huge pool of Section 8 voucher holders, and then you have to jump over all of these hurdles to actually get the super voucher, right? So you have to be interested in moving, and you have to be interested in moving to what's called an opportunity area, which means it's a neighborhood that has low rates of poverty, low crime, and then you have
It also means not predominantly or almost entirely African American.
Correct.
No, actually, it doesn't mean that anymore. There isn't a racial component to defining opportunity areas as of, I think they stopped doing that like in 2012.
I wasn't referring to it as a bureaucratic nomenclature thing. I was just saying that the reality of Chicago is that that's where these vouchers are. Right.
Right. And
then do you want to explain what the personal qualifications had to be?
Yeah. So we crunched the numbers for 2013, and there were about 36,000 people overall in 2013 who had a voucher, households that had a voucher. Now, about 12,000 of those people moved that year. And about 1,000 of them were interested in moving to an opportunity area. So that's the pool of people who could potentially even qualify for a super voucher was about 1,000 people. Now, just being interested did not give you
Yeah.
the super voucher. You had to tick a variety of boxes. Essentially, think about it, it's the same qualification you'd have to fulfill if you wanted to, as a non-voucher person, apply to live in a fancy condo building. You have to have credit, well above 600, usually some places even above 700. You have to have, no evictions in your history. You have to pass a background check. You have to have proof of income. You also have to have enough money for a pretty hefty security deposit. If you're going to live in an apartment that costs $3,000 a month, even with a voucher, you still, as the individual, have to come up with $3,000 to give as your security deposit. So, I mean, only about 27% of those 1,000 people will even check the credit box. Will have credit that's good enough to potentially get into one of those buildings. But a tiny fraction of those people have enough money, have enough liquid cash on them to be able to pay a security deposit for one of those fancy
But
buildings.
are still impoverished enough to qualify for the voucher program itself.
Right. Well, people save money. I mean, people save for years for security deposits. One of the people in our story, Erica Weaver, it took her I think it took her a couple of years to save up. She managed to save up $4,000 to potentially use for the security deposit, and eventually she spent 2 years trying to find a place and couldn't, and ate into those funds
Because she had to spend $50 here, $50 there for
the applications
fees
that
to
she kept
apply.
getting denied,
So just let's set aside for 1 second here. Let's have a moment of numbers. How many people are currently hold vouchers from the CHA? What is the number?
Currently, it's about 46,000 families.
46,000
households.
persons?
Households.
Households.
Yeah.
So
It's like over 100,000
It's 100,000 people.
Yeah.
100,000 of our citizens are in dire enough straits that they qualify for these vouchers. Well, that's not true. They're the ones who have
Got
them.
the vouchers, yeah.
Because many more people than you might think are in dire enough straits to qualify for a voucher. To qualify for a voucher, as a single person in Chicago, if you make less than $43,000 a year, which I don't know, it includes myself and most people I know, that qualifies you for a voucher. But unfortunately, vouchers are not like food stamps or Medicaid or a lot of other anti-poverty programs that we have, where just qualifying for it doesn't mean you get it. You have to play a lottery, essentially. You have to play a lottery to get on a waiting list and then wait for years and then maybe get a voucher.
I'm sorry. So, but I do also just want to make a comparison to the number of people who live in CHA properties. Now, they're not vouchers. They're people who are just simply CHA residents, right? There are many, many fewer of them now than there were 10 years ago.
Yeah.
Do you have any idea what those numbers are?
I think the last, as far as I checked last, there were less than 50,000, less than 20,000 households that live in public housing.
Right, because that was the deal when they started tearing all the high-rises down. The plan for transformation was going to replace 25,000 units by 2010, and they did, a couple thousand or something.
Yeah, I think it may even be as low as like 17 to 18,000 households that live in hard public housing units.
Yeah. So all along, you could argue that the program either was a way of just simply getting rid of most public housing and throwing people onto vouchers, or that some people really believed that they could do the 25,000, but the political realities were that it just wasn't ever going to happen. And meanwhile, we got all those buildings knocked down, and for most Chicagoans, that's a good thing, I suppose. So, where we go now is that this program is up and running. A few people are in it. At its height, it was 766 people, I think I got out of your thing. Now, we should say that most of them were at the 150%. Here we go with the numbers again, folks. But, okay, so you have a voucher, and it has a value, whatever it is.
Right.
CHA said, we're going to try giving some people 1.5 times, 150%. And there's going to be some people who we think are exceptional enough that we're going to go all the way up to 300%.
This is actually slightly wrong, and
Okay.
this was the same mistake that I made when I first started editing the story.
Correct me, please,
So the
editor.
CHA didn't make a distinction between people who were somehow more worthy than others and said, like, you're more worthy, so you get the 300%. that determination was made by whatever the rent was in the building that they got into. So if you pass all of these check marks, right, you've got the credit score, you've got the clean background check, you have the clean eviction record, and you apply to a building and you're accepted, and the rent in that building necessitates a 300% voucher, then the CHA would give you the 300% voucher.
You could go all the way up to
Yes.
3 times or 300%.
So that was the ceiling.
In a few cases, that was
Yes,
that
in a
was
very small number of cases.
dozens.
But
of
it
people.
wasn't a reflection. It wasn't like if I got 300% and Maya got 150%,
'Cause
that
she's
I
just
was
not as-
deemed.
she's just not as good as
Right.
you.
It was not about that. It just meant that I got into a building that
Right.
that was that much more
And
expensive than hers.
The other thing is that the 766 families, those were people that were receiving any kind of increased voucher amount, anything above 100.
Anything, or even 103%
Yes.
would.
Y-
Okay.
Right. I think they start tallying at 110. But 2/3 of that 766 families, 2/3 of them were getting less than 150%.
Okay.
So
All right, good.
it's only about 230 families that were getting between 150, 1.5 times the voucher amount, and 3 times the
Uh-huh. Okay.
voucher amount.
Again, so few people compared to the tens of thousands
tens
of
and
people.
tens
Yes.
of thousands. And if you include the people who are in CHA housing, it's many, many more. All right, so let's do the old tick-tock here, okay? When does the first public protest happen? Is it something in the media, or is it, where does it happen? How does this resistance begin to build?
So the first thing that happened.
I should say we start this in 2011?
14.
No,
Oh, the program or the
program.
program started in operating 2011. It was worked out with HUD, between CHA and HUD in 2010.
This
and
was all during the Rahm Emanuel administration. Not that that necessarily means anything, but it's all happened.
That's correct.
Okay, it's all happened in the Emanuel years. Okay, so they get started, 2011, what happens?
And so that's when they first start offering these opportunities for more flexibility with the rents. And the first couple of years, everything is fine. Nobody really knew anything about it. And then in the summer of 2014, Cranes published an article that talked about these super-vouchers, that talked about...
Is that the first time the term was used, super-vouchers?
Yes, we weren't able to track down the exact genesis of the term, but it did appear in the Cranes article, and the CHA does not refer to these as super-vouchers. So somewhere along the line, somebody used the term, and it stuck. And then very soon after that, Congressman Aaron Schock stood before Congress and essentially pilloried the program, and then shortly after that, that same summer of 2014, he requested that HUD do an audit of this program to determine whether it was in accordance with the CHA's agreement, operational agreement with HUD.
Aaron Schock, who is a kind of a super-voucher congressman of his own making, what with his $40,000 office upgrade and all the rest. But he knows something about using public money in an inappropriate way, I guess. So it breaks in Cranes. It immediately becomes fodder for an ambitious congressman. The Congress gets involved. The mayor even says they've come off the tracks. This is crazy. He kind of denounces it. And then that's it then, right? It all just starts to come apart at that point.
Well, so I spoke with, one of the problems is that during the life of this program, there were 4 different CEOs at the CHA.
That too,
so, as different people came to the helm, there wasn't a whole lot of institutional memory about why and how this program got started. And so I spoke with Michael Merchant, who was the CEO in the summer of 2014, at the time when the news broke. And he actually told me that the program had been brought to his attention, and the possibility of there being some inappropriate use of the money, that it was paying for 2 expensive buildings, had been brought to his attention as early as the fall of 2013, and that internally the agency was thinking about whether or not they need to scale something back or change the way they were operating. and then the news broke. And the way that Merchant described it was that basically they were already working on changing the program in some way, and then he started getting all the calls, and the media was coming after the program, and but there were already plans in the works to reconsider the program. Now, some observers, again, media observers, have speculated that the timing in the summer of 2014, it was before Mayor Emanuel's re-election, and that the timing was very, it was a bad moment to have a lot of bad press for city agencies, for City Hall. So Mr. Merchant said that there was no pressure from City Hall, but observers have noted that the timing was interesting.
There's also a really interesting interagency backstory here, which Maya will probably have to explain, but that really fascinated us. And this has to do with the conversations between the CHA and HUD over the program, right? So Aaron Schock requests an audit of the program, which means that CHA has to give certain kinds of financial analysis to HUD to prove to HUD, or at least to describe to HUD, the cost effectiveness of the program. And it seems that CHA never provided HUD with the exact kind of analysis that it wanted in order to really assess the program. And correct me if I'm wrong, Maya, but I don't think it's not really clear to us that CHA ever did that kind of analysis, right? But one of the reasons they didn't do it is because they had come to a previous agreement with HUD that cost effectiveness was not necessarily the number one priority of the program, that the number one priority of the program, of this particular program, were these pro-integration, pro-mobility ideals that HUD and the CHA had determined were important. So it's complicated because in the abstract, do you want government agencies to operate in a cost-effective manner? Of course you do, but they had previously agreed that that wasn't the goal with this program. And
it's a tiny program.
Right. So at one point, I think Cranes had this expose that said, HUD says the program isn't cost-effective, and everybody lost their minds a little bit, as if that were proof that this program had somehow been corrupt or mismanaged or ill thought out. And our reporting found that it was a much more complicated situation than that.
And I think, Robin, you're raising a very interesting question here, because some of the criticism has been not of the program, but of the way that the CHA handled the program, if the CHA even knew it had the program. I mean, sometimes you even wonder about that. And I do think that we do have to talk about some of the criticisms of the program that I think have been valid. The Sun-Times has done a series of programs on it, which actually were I must say that's the first time that I actually saw this. It became part of my consciousness. And one of the things that the Sun-Times and others have raised is the question of how the people who are the landlords got selected. Like everything else in Chicago, it appears that there's at least a whiff of some, what do you want to call it, favoritism, that the connected landlords got to get these vouchers and that kind of thing. Do you believe any of that?
Well, no, and that's because essentially any landlord who had a property in an opportunity area, that passed the CHA inspection, and who was willing to give a year lease to a voucher holder could have gotten this money. And I think the story in Chicago about landlords is much less about politically connected landlords that are getting money for fancy buildings, and much more a story about two things: landlords who rampantly discriminate against voucher holders and refuse to take them, even though it is illegal in the city of Chicago to say, I'm not going to take you because of your voucher. And the other thing is landlords who provide substandard housing in segregated poor neighborhoods, and that essentially feed off this government money, and are able to get away with that. And I think that's a much bigger problem. And you brought this up earlier, but I just think to put things in perspective, the super-voucher program costs $4.8 million a year. Now, these buildings were very nice, no inspection problems, stable, nice buildings, sometimes with a doorman, with maintenance staff, et cetera, et cetera. There are buildings that, there are landlords that get, money from the CHA through the vouchers for units that fail inspections countless times during a year, sometimes up to like 18 times we saw in their records. And the landlords who had properties in the city that had the highest number of inspection violations throughout the year, they collected over $4 million. Just the 7 highest, inspection violating properties in the city collected basically almost the same amount as the super-voucher program.
Well, that's an inconvenient number, isn't it?
Right, and what's more is if you factor in how much the city is being overcharged in the situations where landlords are renting units that on the market would get very little money, but they get more money with the vouchers. That number is astronomical, and unfortunately nobody has really crunched these numbers for Chicago, but there's just been a book that came out, this book called Evicted by Matthew Desmond, a Harvard sociologist, and he crunched that very same number for the city of Milwaukee. Now, Milwaukee's housing choice voucher program is 8 times smaller than Chicago's, but in the city of Milwaukee, he found that taxpayers are paying an additional $3.6 million a year for that overcharging margin. So think about how much more money that is in Chicago, given the program is so much bigger.
And where's the comparable outrage over that, right?
I have to tell you, I thought that was one of the most interesting things in your article, and it's all the way at the end of the article. You have to get all the way to the end to find it, but I think it's really interesting. And so let's look at that in a sort of a nuts and bolts way. I am a vile, evil landlord, and I have this really, rat-infested, crappy building, and I know that I can maybe get, $300 for one of these apartments. But you come to me with your voucher that says that you're able to give me $900 for that building or for that apartment.
Yeah.
So hey, look at that. Well, let's make the number a little bit less. Let's just say it's $100. Let's say I get a premium of $100 because you're a voucher tenant that I wouldn't get if you were not a voucher tenant. Multiply that by how many is it? Somewhere around 30,000 tenants in this system.
Yeah.
If every one of them was being overcharged by even $100, that's a lot of money.
It adds up quickly.
Yeah. And in Milwaukee, this guy Desmond found that it was, I think the average overcharging was maybe like $70. So it's not, for one single unit, it may not seem like a lot, but multiplied by thousands and thousands of apartments, and some of the biggest landlords, they're companies that rent to housing choice voucher families, and they have thousands of units in the city.
And this is the context, right? If you zoom out a little bit from this voucher program to the bigger stories here, one of them is about housing instability for the poor. Right? That is one of the bigger stories here. Is that if you are poor, whether or not you have a voucher, the degree to which your housing is unstable, unpredictable, where you have to move and move and move and move again, is just shocking. And I think that's one of the big things that this book by Matthew Desmond has really given us as far as a greater understanding of what it's like for people in that situation. Because even though, for example, Chicago has tens of thousands of voucher holders, there are tens of thousands of more people who are equally poor, who are just subject to the whims of the market and don't have access to those vouchers. And as we said before, the thing that this super voucher program brought to the people who were lucky enough to have access to it was this incredible degree of stability, where they had access to a good building that had a clean maintenance record, where they could stay, for at least a year. So again, I think that's one of the tragedies of having killed the program, is that the people who, like Lorena, had previously lived in these nice buildings are now, on whatever it is, like month 7 or 8 of sleeping on their friends' couches because they have not been able to find a place to live after having their voucher scaled back.
This really, it reminds me of back in my days working for the city, when there was a big debate going on at the time about all these things that seemed so important at the time, but as time diminishes them, there was a huge debate about whether the CTA should continue to run its full, what they used to call OWL service, the bus service, all night long. Many of these buses would run from one end to the other, and they'd pick up 1 or 2 people, and there was a huge debate about it. And anyway, I remember saying at the time that, maybe we ought to just take that money and just pay people to take a cab, that it would probably cost less. Now, I mean, that's a goofy argument, and I didn't even mean it when I said it at the time. But there's a whiff of that in this conversation here today too, because if you can take someone for a little bit more than this arbitrary median number, if you can get them to 150 or 160 or 180% and put them into housing that is demonstrably better than the housing they're going to get with the voucher, then aren't we all isn't that paying us all a premium in the number of police arrests and everything else? I mean, you just start talking about all the other social things that add into this systemic, racially based kind of steering of people into bad places.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, we will never know the long-term benefits of this program. We will never know how, first of all, for example, how much less money it costs in the long term to have someone housed in a nice property rather than a poor property or a bad property. We'll never know how soon somebody might be able to get off this program if their housing is stable and maybe they're able to take employment opportunities they wouldn't otherwise have taken. And the other thing I think is important to add is that to give people an opportunity to live in better housing in Chicago, you didn't have to put them in downtown condos. But the reality was that was where there was available housing.
Those were places that were willing to take them, even a 300% voucher, because as you point out, a lot of times people with these would go out looking around, and as soon as the landlords found out that it was a voucher, even though it was for $2,000, they still didn't want to do it.
And even for someone like Erica Weaver, one of the women we profiled in the story, I mean, I found Erica to be a very impressive person. She was very ambitious. She was going back to law school at Loyola at age 39, I think. Just had a kind of professionalism to her that I think defies a lot of the stereotypes of what it means to be someone who lives in poverty or have a voucher. And she described to us how impressed landlords would be with her when they met her, and how impressed they were with her ambitions, with her admittance to Loyola Law School. And then as soon as she told them that she had a voucher, they felt deceived somehow, as if they had been misled. And time after time, she was rejected from these housing options.
Yeah. The stigma is amazing. You guys have written the reader has done many wonderful stories, and I know, Maya, you in particular have done some terrific things, particularly that thing you recently did on the problem with mixed income, and we don't have time to get into that now, but that's another show in itself. You get into one of these newly developed mixed income buildings that have replaced a lot of the CHA, and there's a whole bunch of social and economic issues going on inside those buildings that we're not going to sort out for another 20 years, I suppose. But anyway, there was one last thing that I promised myself I was going to bring up. I love the comments sections in the Reader because although they get pretty nasty at times, they are really, they're thoughtful in their own ways. And yours attracted quite a bit of negative comment, as you know. And one of them was, why did you choose not to mention Reggie Daniel, the disabled, unemployed guy who had a super voucher, was in a wheelchair, living in a rather posh building, and he shot and killed one of the tenants in the gym? Is that not relevant to this discussion?
I mean, no, it's not relevant because he's one person. Discussing this man and this alleged murder, I mean, to me, that feeds into a certain type of stereotypical idea that we have about who has a voucher, what kind of people live on Section 8 housing. But I mean, there's lots of murders in the city every day, both in poor neighborhoods and in rich ones, and whoever commits those crimes, we don't tend to think that they're somehow representative of the group they're part of. At least that's not the right way to think about those issues. And that situation, I mean, that is in no way an indictment on this program. That's in no way whatever that man may or may not have done. Like, that's not an indictment of this program. That's not an indictment of people who have vouchers. And it really has nothing to do with anything. I mean, that's a personal situation that man was that's in that man's life that is a tragedy, but it really has, I don't know, we didn't think that it had anything to do with discussing this program.
I will say that we talked about that story. I mean, when I saw that story, I sent it to Maya and Mariba and Carrie Leiderson, who coordinates the News Nexus program at Northwestern that helped fund this story. And I said, what do you think of this story? Because what strikes me is that this is a story about the voucher program when the voucher program has nothing to do with this alleged murder. And the subtext of this story seemed to me to be, why in God's name did we let this poor man live in a building next to rich people? I mean, that seemed to be the point of the story to me. And that was, again, the subtext of so much of the reporting that we saw prior to this. And I don't think that this is unique to talking about housing vouchers. It reminds me of, attempts, for example, with food stamps to make it illegal for people on food stamps to buy things like steak and lobster. There's this cultural and ideological thread that runs through American culture and has for a very long time, which is that if you are poor, it must be because you did something wrong. You deserve to be poor. You are lazy or substandard or bad in some way, and you don't deserve nice things because you didn't work hard enough to get them. Well, the women that we profiled in the story are some of the hardest working people I have ever come across, and I think that again, it's ideology and it's opinion. It's not based in reality, and we wanted to stay away from that kind of ideological invective and the demonization of poverty, which seemed like totally incidental to whether or not this program could achieve its stated goals, which was to provide mobility and to chip away, even if slowly, at integration.
Right.
Good place to let it drop. We've run over time about 10 minutes here, but I really appreciate you staying with us. This to me is the kind of journalism that I really love. It's taking the overall view of things and then finding this one little pocket in there and saying, yeah, but how about we spend some time looking at this one thing and try to see if maybe it'll help us understand the bigger picture more completely. And also, you mentioned it before, but thanks to the Social Justice News Nexus up in Northwestern for, I guess they funding
this and the Fund for Investigative Journalism as well.
Okay, great. Maya, thank you so much for being with us today. I really enjoyed talking with you, and Robin Amer too, from news editor for The Reader. We've got to have you guys back some more, talk some more. We got lots more to talk about. Okay, thanks. It's all about you. You have been watching Chicago Newsroom here on CAN TV. Our plan next week is to have Troy LaRivera on the show, and we hope that's going to happen. We don't know. He's got to talk to his lawyer first, but that'll be an interesting conversation, so check back with us and see if that happens. Who knows? I'm Ken Davis. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again next week. But remember, you can always see all the shows, all of them, all 311 or however many there are, right here. Is that right? 300? No, is that right? It's hundreds and hundreds right here at this address. And we'll see you next week again. Okay, thanks. Bye.